The military training hall buzzed with noise. Boots stomping, orders shouted, laughter echoing. But when Lieutenant Sarah Cole entered, the laughter grew louder. This time directed at her. She was the only woman in a squad full of arrogant men who believed she didn't belong. Her uniform, though perfectly pressed, became the target of their ridicule. "Maybe you're wearing the wrong outfit," one sneered. A kitchen apron would fit better. Sarah ignored them at first. But when Captain Hayes, known for his cruel humor, smirked and ordered, "Remove your uniform. Let's see if you even deserve to wear it," the entire room fell silent. What happened next would shock every soldier in that hall and change the way they saw her forever. The early morning air at Fort Raven Military Academy was sharp with the scent of sweat, iron, and grit. Recruits marched in perfect formation as the sun broke over the horizon, flooding the training grounds in gold. Orders echoed through the base like thunder. It was a world built on strength, obedience, and dominance, a place where weakness was not forgiven, and in that world stood Lieutenant Sarah Cole, a woman who never asked for attention, only respect. She was tall but not imposing, slender but steady. Her movements were disciplined, almost poetic. Every step she took seemed measured, deliberate. Her uniform was always immaculate, her boots polished to a mirror shine. Yet behind those sharp brown eyes was a storm, a story buried under layers of silence. When Sarah joined the elite training division, whispers began before she had even stepped into the barracks. They sent a woman to this unit? Must be a political stunt. She'll never last a week. Their laughter followed her everywhere, in the mess hall, on the obstacle course, even during roll call. They mocked her smaller frame, her calm voice, her refusal to engage in their arrogant banter. But what they couldn't see was that Sarah had walked through storms they would never survive. Years before this assignment, she had served in covert operations overseas, missions that were never recorded, victories never celebrated. Her squad had fallen in one of those missions, and though the world never learned their names, she had carved their memory into her skin and her soul. That was her secret, her strength hidden beneath the fabric of her uniform. Every morning before sunrise, Sarah trained alone behind the supply hangar. While others slept, she pushed herself through impossible drills, push-ups until her arms trembled, sprints until her lungs burned. Hand-to-hand combat sequences repeated until perfection became muscle memory. When the others arrived for morning exercises, she had already finished hers. Yet instead of admiration, she received smirks and sarcastic comments. "Trying to impress someone, Cole. You'll break before you make it." Sarah never replied. She didn't have to. Her silence irritated them more than any comeback ever could. But beneath that calm exterior, she remembered every word, every sneer, every laugh. She filed them away, not out of anger, but as fuel. She wasn't here to prove them wrong. She was here to prove herself right. And though none of them knew it, the woman they ridiculed was about to teach them the hardest lesson of their lives, that real strength has nothing to do with muscle or medals. It comes from what you've already survived. The training grounds at Fort Raven were merciless. From dawn to dusk, recruits were pushed beyond exhaustion, crawling through mud, scaling walls slick with rain, carrying weights until their bones screamed. For most, it was hell. For Sarah Cole, it was home. She moved with precision, her face calm even as sweat poured down her temple. She never complained, never faltered. But the more she excelled, the more the others despised her. They couldn't stand how she stayed composed when they lost control. They couldn't understand how she met every challenge head-on, without boasting. To them, her silence was arrogance, and arrogance was unforgivable, so they mocked her. It began small. Cruel jokes whispered just loud enough for her to hear. A misplaced helmet, a canteen emptied when she wasn't looking. But over time, the taunts turned venomous. "Hey, Cole, you think you can keep up with real soldiers? Maybe she should be in the medical tent sewing uniforms instead of wearing one." The barracks echoed with laughter. Sarah never responded. She tied her boots tighter and kept walking. But even the strongest silence can crack under constant pressure. One grey morning, the recruits were called to the field for a close-quarters combat assessment. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of mud and gun oil. Captain Hayes, a tall, broad man with a permanent sneer, watched from the edge of the ring, his arms folded. He had a reputation. He broke spirits for sport. "Pair up," he barked. "Let's see who can actually fight." When no one volunteered to spar with Sarah, Hayes smirked. "What's wrong, gentlemen? Afraid to hurt the lady?" The men laughed until Hayes stepped forward and pointed directly at her. "Cole, step into the ring." Sarah obeyed, standing firm. Across from her stood Corporal Briggs, one of the loudest voices in the barracks, built like a tank and twice as arrogant. When the whistle blew, he lunged. Sarah sidestepped, calm, reading him like a book. He charged again, faster this time, his fists slicing through the air. She moved with surgical precision, blocking, pivoting, deflecting. The laughter around them began to fade. Briggs swung wide, and Sarah took him down in one flawless motion, using his momentum against him. He hit the ground hard, gasping. The field went silent. For a moment, then Hayes clapped sarcastically. "Impressive. But let's be honest, he went easy on you." The men laughed again. Briggs' pride flared red, his embarrassment feeding the cruelty. He kicked mud at her boots and spat. "You're not one of us." "You never will be." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Later that day, during inspection, Captain Hayes decided to push further. He called the squad to attention, pacing in front of them like a predator. "Discipline," he began, "means knowing your place. Some of you still don't understand that." His eyes locked on Sarah. "Cole, step forward." She did. Chin high, shoulders straight, Hayes circled her slowly. The other recruits watching with thinly veiled smirks. "You walk like a soldier. You talk like a soldier. But I'm not convinced you are one." His words sliced through the air. "You wear this uniform like you've earned it. But anyone can put on the colors. Let's see what's underneath." A low murmur rippled through the squad. Sarah froze. Was he serious? "Remove your uniform," Hayes said coldly. "If you've truly earned the right to wear it, you shouldn't be afraid to show what's beneath." The crowd fell silent, half in shock, half in anticipation. The humiliation hung in the air like a knife. Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. For years, she had carried herself with quiet dignity, swallowing every insult. But this was different. This was an attack on her identity, on the uniform she had bled for. She met Hayes's eyes, unflinching. "You want to see what's beneath?" she said softly. "Fine." Her voice was calm, almost too calm. The kind of calm that comes before a storm. And as she began unbuttoning her jacket, the laughter died. No one could have guessed what they were about to see. The hall had gone completely silent. Even the sound of boots shifting on the polished floor seemed too loud. Every pair of eyes, officers, recruits, even Captain Hayes, were locked on Lieutenant Sarah Cole. She stood in the center of the inspection bay, her posture perfectly straight, her breathing steady. The morning light streamed through the high windows, streaking across her uniform like the beam of a spotlight on a stage she never wanted. Slowly, deliberately, Sarah began to unbutton her jacket. The heavy fabric rustled faintly, the only sound in a room filled with tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. No one dared speak. The recruits, who had mocked her only hours before, suddenly looked unsure of themselves when the jacket slipped from her shoulders. Revealing the dark combat shirt beneath, Captain Hayes smirked. "Go on," he said softly. "You've got nothing to hide, right?" Sarah met his gaze, calm, unwavering, then pulled her shirt over her head in one smooth motion, and that's when the world stopped. Gasps echoed around the hall. One recruit actually dropped his helmet. Across her back, etched in black and silver ink, was the phoenix, its wings spread wide, flames rising from its tail, the feathers carved with intricate precision. Around it, a ring of names in military code spiraled outward like a halo. But it wasn't just a tattoo, it was a symbol, one that only a handful of people in the entire military would recognize. The Phoenix emblem belonged to the Shadow Squadron, a covert unit so elite, so classified, that even senior officers only knew it through rumor. They were ghosts, Operatives who handled missions no one else could survive, and now, standing before them, was one of those ghosts. Captain Hayes's smirk vanished. He took an involuntary step back, his voice faltering. That's impossible. Shadow Squadron was disbanded 5 years ago. Sarah's expression didn't change. Yes, she said quietly. After my team didn't make it home, the recruits looked from one to another, their faces pale. The woman they had mocked, insulted, and tried to humiliate was a decorated hero, a survivor of missions that most men wouldn't dare to imagine. Private Briggs, the one who had kicked mud at her earlier, stared at the tattoo in disbelief. You were one of them? Sarah turned her head slightly. The last one. A heavy silence filled the room. The kind of silence that carries the weight of shame. Captain Hayes's jaw tightened. For the first time, he looked uncertain, small even. His voice, usually sharp as a blade, softened. Lieutenant Cole, I had no idea. Sarah lifted her combat shirt from the floor and began to put it back on, her movements slow and controlled. You weren't supposed to, she replied evenly. My service record is classified. She buttoned her jacket again, restoring the uniform they had tried to strip from her. When she looked up, her eyes burned with quiet authority. You wanted to see what was beneath the uniform, Captain. Now you know. But remember this, respect isn't earned by tearing others down. It's earned by surviving what would have destroyed you. Her words landed like a strike. Hayes had nothing left to say. The recruits stood at attention, their faces red with embarrassment and regret. Some lowered their heads. Others looked at her with awe. Sarah stepped forward, her boots echoing through the hall as she passed them, every stride reclaiming the dignity they tried to take from her. No one laughed this time. Not a sound followed her, only silence and the faint echo of a truth none of them would ever forget. For a long moment, no one moved. The air inside the inspection hall was heavy, not with noise, but with the absence of it. The same men who had laughed only an hour ago now stood frozen, their mockery turned to disbelief, their pride replaced with shame. Lieutenant Sarah Cole stood calm and collected, her uniform once again perfectly buttoned, her expression unreadable. The fiery sunlight streaming through the high windows caught the faint shimmer of sweat on her brow, the only sign that she was human and not carved from steel. Her eyes drifted over the recruits, one by one, not with anger, not even with triumph, but with quiet disappointment. It was not the look of someone who had won a battle. It was the look of someone who had outgrown one. Captain Hayes stood rooted to the spot, his jaw tight, the weight of guilt pressing heavily on his chest. The room that had once been his stage of authority now felt like a courtroom, and he was the one on trial. He cleared his throat, his voice low. Lieutenant Cole. She didn't flinch, didn't turn. I didn't know, he said softly. I had no idea who you were. Sarah finally faced him, her expression calm but her eyes cold and clear. You didn't have to know who I was, Captain, she replied. You only had to respect who I am. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Hayes lowered his head slightly, the gesture small but genuine. You've earned my respect, Lieutenant, he said quietly. And my apology, Sarah nodded once. Keep your apology. Just make sure no one else here ever forgets what respect costs. Around her, the recruits shifted uncomfortably. Their faces told a story of guilt, remorse, and a dawning sense of humility. Private Briggs, the same man who had mocked her every day, stepped forward hesitantly. Ma'am, he said, his voice low, I was wrong. About everything. Sarah met his eyes. There was no anger in her gaze, only understanding. Good, she said softly. Learn from it. Briggs nodded, swallowing hard. Yes, ma'am. As Sarah turned to leave, the recruits straightened instinctively, their bodies aligning in perfect formation. For the first time since her arrival, they stood not out of obligation, but out of respect. When Sarah stepped through the doors of the training hall, the blinding sunlight met her face. Outside, the wind carried the distant echo of drills and orders. But for her, time seemed to slow. She inhaled deeply, the air crisp with the scent of metal and dust, the familiar smell of the only life she had ever known. Behind her, through the thick doors, silence still reigned. No laughter, no whispers, just a stunned, reflective quiet that would last long after she was gone. Captain Hayes remained in the hall, staring at the spot where she had stood. He wasn't the same man he had been that morning. None of them were, and though Sarah didn't see it, every one of those recruits carried a new lesson carved into their minds. One that no drill, no mission, no punishment could ever teach. Sarah walked toward the training yard, her boots crunching softly against the gravel. The sunlight touched the back of her neck, warm, steady, almost comforting. She paused for a moment and looked back at the building. The faint reflection of her silhouette shimmered in the window glass. Strong, solitary, unbroken, a faint smile touched her lips. She didn't need their applause. She didn't need their validation. Respect had finally been earned, not through shouting, not through pride, but through truth. And in the silence that followed her revelation, Fort Raven learned what true leadership looked like. The sun was sinking behind the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of crimson and gold. The training base, once echoing with noise and drills, now lay quiet, blanketed in the calm of twilight. Lieutenant Sarah Cole sat alone on a wooden bench just beyond the barracks. The sound of distant footsteps faded, replaced by the soft hum of evening wind. She unbuttoned the top of her jacket, letting the fabric loosen slightly. The fading light touched the edge of her tattoo, still faintly visible through her shirt, the phoenix, wings outstretched in silent defiance. For a moment, she simply sat there, breathing, remembering. Her eyes traced the horizon where day met night. It reminded her of the line she had walked all her life, between obedience and defiance, between grief and strength, between who she had been and who she had become. Her mind drifted back to the night that had changed everything, the mission that ended Shadow Squadron. A blinding explosion, a radio screaming static, the cries of her team, her family fading into chaos. "We hold the line." Her commander's last words had echoed through the comms. No matter what, Sarah had survived, barely. The others hadn't. The phoenix tattoo was her way of carrying them with her, their names woven into its wings. Every line of ink was a memory, every curve a promise, and every time she put on her uniform, she carried their strength beneath it. She whispered softly to the night, her voice barely a breath. "I didn't show them the tattoo to prove my worth. I showed them what sacrifice looks like." Her gaze hardened, not in anger but resolve. They needed to see that respect isn't about rank or muscle or pride. It's about understanding what someone has endured to still stand tall. A quiet tear slid down her cheek, catching the last light of the sunset before falling onto her gloved hand. She didn't wipe it away. It wasn't weakness. It was remembrance. Behind her, the sound of boots approached, slow, deliberate. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Captain Hayes stood a few steps behind her, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "You taught us something today, Lieutenant. Something none of the manuals could." Sarah didn't look back. "It wasn't my intention to teach, Captain. Just to remind," he nodded, even though she couldn't see it. "We'll remember, all of us." And for once, his tone wasn't one of command. It was one of gratitude. When Hayes left, Sarah rose slowly from the bench. The last light of day touched her face, illuminating the faint outline of the phoenix on her back. The bird seemed alive in the glow, its wings rising in defiance against the dying sun. Sarah whispered to herself, her voice steady and full of conviction, "They took everything from us, but not what we stood for. From the ashes we rise." She placed her cap back on, squared her shoulders, and began walking toward the distant training field, where new recruits were lining up for tomorrow's drills. As she disappeared into the horizon, the wind carried the faint sound of her voice, a whisper that became the moral of her story. Never judge a soldier by their uniform. You don't know the battles they've already fought just to wear it. True strength is quiet. True courage leaves scars. And true respect is earned, not demanded.